There is a question that philosophy has been asking about itself for as long as it has existed. Not what is the right answer to the hard questions, that is what individual philosophers argue about. The deeper question is, what is philosophy for? What does it actually do for the person who practices it? What does a life look like when it is genuinely shaped by philosophical thinking, not just informed by philosophical positions, but actually lived differently because of it?
Socrates said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." That is probably the most quoted sentence in the history of philosophy. And it is worth asking seriously what he meant because the popular interpretation that you should think more and be more self-aware is true but thin. What Socrates was describing was something more demanding and more specific than general self-reflection.
Welcome to Philosophy for Lunch. I'm Shawn.
And I'm Claire. Today, we are asking the question directly, not through a particular thinker, not through a specific argument, but as the question itself. What does it actually mean to live philosophically? What is different about the life of someone who takes philosophy seriously as a practice rather than just an interest? And is the difference worth the effort? Big ideas, human conversations, let's go.
I want to say one thing before we get into it because I think it matters for how you hear this episode. We are not asking this question from the outside, as if we are observers describing a practice we do not personally engage in. We are asking it from the inside, as people who have been spending significant time with these ideas and trying imperfectly to let them actually change something. That does not make us authorities on the philosophical life, but it means the question is live for us. And I think live questions produce better thinking than academic ones.
Let us start with Socrates, because the unexamined life sentence is the founding claim of philosophical living as a practice, and I think it is widely misunderstood.
The context matters. Socrates said it at his trial in 499 BCE, when he had been convicted of impiety and corrupting the youth of Athens and was facing the death penalty. He was being offered a deal: stop philosophizing, stop going around asking people uncomfortable questions about what they actually believe and whether those beliefs hold up, and you can live. He refused, and his reason was not that he happened to enjoy philosophy. It was that the examined life specifically, the kind of active, ongoing, questioning engagement with your own beliefs and your own soul that he had been practicing, was the only life he recognized as worth living.
That is a much stronger claim than general self-awareness. Socrates is not saying that thoughtful people live better lives. He is saying that the specific activity of philosophical examination, of subjecting your beliefs, your values, your way of living to rigorous questioning, is constitutive of a fully human life. Without it, you are not fully living. You are moving through the motions of a life without actually inhabiting it.
And what is the examination exactly? In Plato's dialogues, it looks like conversation, specifically like a kind of conversation in which Socrates asks someone to define something they claim to know, and then shows, through careful questioning, that their definition does not hold up. You say you know what courage is. Socrates asks questions. Your definition turns out to be circular, or to exclude cases it should include, or to imply things you do not believe. You thought you knew. It turns out you had an opinion, a confident, functional opinion that had never been tested. The examination is the testing.
Hannah Arendt, in her reading of Socrates that we touched on last week, makes a crucial distinction here. She says Socrates was not primarily trying to produce knowledge. He was trying to produce thinking to interrupt the smooth operation of settled conviction and introduce the pause that makes genuine judgment possible. The examined life, on this reading, is not a life in which you have arrived at true beliefs. It is a life in which you are continuously in the process of examining, in which the examination never stops, because the questions are not the kind that get definitively answered.
Which is both more honest and more demanding than the popular version. The popular version implies that if you read enough philosophy and think carefully enough, you will arrive at a settled, examined worldview that you can then live from. Socrates and Arendt are both suggesting something harder, that the examination is ongoing, that arriving at settled conviction is itself a sign that the examination has stopped, and that the genuinely philosophical life is characterized by a permanent openness to having your most important beliefs challenged and revised.
Different philosophical traditions have answered the question of what the philosophical life looks like in quite different ways, and I think it is worth surveying a few of them because the differences are revealing. The Stoic answer is the one we covered in the Marcus Aurelius episode, and it is probably the most practically detailed of the ancient answers. The philosophical life for the Stoics is a life organized around the dichotomy of control, around the ongoing practice of distinguishing what is up to you from what is not, and directing your attention and energy accordingly. It involves a morning preparation, a kind of mental rehearsal for the day's difficulties. It involves the evening review, asking yourself what you did well, what you could have done better, where you were led astray by anger or the desire for approval. It involves the memento mori, the deliberate contemplation of impermanence. And it involves ongoing attention to the quality of your own reasoning, asking whether your judgments are tracking something real or being distorted by emotion, habit, or self-interest.
What the Stoic version emphasizes is practice the idea that the philosophical life is not a set of beliefs you hold, but a set of exercises you perform. Marcus Aurelius was not writing the Meditations because he had figured out Stoicism. He was writing them because he kept failing to live up to it and needed the daily renewal of the practice. The philosophical life, on this model, looks less like a state you achieve and more like a discipline you maintain, the way an athlete maintains a training regimen or a musician maintains a practice schedule. Not because you are getting progressively worse at it, but because the conditions you are practicing against the pull of comfort, the seductiveness of anger, the temptation to blame what you cannot control, are permanent features of being human.
The Aristotelian answer is different, and in some ways richer. For Aristotle, the philosophical life is not primarily about managing your inner states. It is about the full development and exercise of your capacities, intellectual, moral, social. The examined life is embedded in a whole conception of what a good human life looks like, one that involves genuine friendship, civic participation, the cultivation of virtue through practice, and the ongoing exercise of practical wisdom in the concrete situations you actually face. Philosophy is not separate from life. It is the most fully developed form of life.
The Buddhist tradition, which shares more with Greek philosophy than is often recognized, emphasizes something slightly different again: the examination of the self not to improve it, but to see through it. The project of mindfulness, of sustained, non-judgmental attention to your own mental processes, is philosophical in the deepest sense. It does not take the self as given and ask how to optimize it. It asks what the self actually is, and it suggests that careful examination reveals something quite different from what we ordinarily assume.
And the existentialist answer, which we covered through de Beauvoir, is about authenticity, the ongoing project of acknowledging your freedom, taking responsibility for your choices, refusing the bad faith that treats your situation as fixed and determined. The philosophical life, on this model, is one in which you own your own construction, in which you recognize that who you are is something you are continuously making, and you take that making seriously rather than hiding from it.
What all of these have in common, despite their differences, is this: the philosophical life requires more than intellectual engagement with ideas. It requires that the ideas do something to you, that they change how you see your situation, how you respond to difficulty, how you relate to other people, what you take seriously, and what you let go. Philosophy that does not touch your life is not philosophy as a practice. It is philosophy as entertainment, which is fine, but different. Looking back at the episodes we have done, the thread I find most important is the one connecting self-knowledge to political responsibility. Anna Freud, Jung, Kahneman, these are all, at one level, accounts of why clear seeing is hard and what the obstacles to it are. And Arendt is the account of what happens when the obstacles win, when an entire population stops examining, stops thinking independently, and participates in catastrophe through the accumulation of small, thoughtless choices. The inner work and the outer stakes are not separable. The person who practices genuine self-examination is not just building a better inner life, they are building a slightly more resistant political character. And that matters.
Which is why this episode belongs in the series, rather than as a summary of it. It is not a conclusion. It is a reflection on what the practice is for, on what we are actually doing when we take these questions seriously, and why it matters beyond the intellectual satisfaction of engaging with good ideas. The philosophical life is available to anyone willing to practice it. It requires no special access, no credentials, no particular background. It requires only the willingness to keep returning to the hard questions, and to let the answers, when they come, actually change something.
Before I try to say what living philosophically means, I want to clear away some things it does not mean. Because there are several versions of philosophy as life practice that I think are either useless or actively counterproductive.
The first is philosophy as a collection of positions. The idea that living philosophically means having worked out your views on free will and personal identity and the foundations of morality, and being ready to defend those views against challengers. That version of philosophy is more like a sport than a practice. It is about winning arguments rather than thinking more clearly. And winning arguments is quite consistent with not changing at all, with defending your initial positions more effectively rather than revising them in response to better evidence and better reasoning.
The second is philosophy as self-improvement packaging. The Stoic morning routine as productivity hack. The Aristotelian virtue framework as character optimization program. The mindfulness adjacent version of ancient wisdom that strips out the difficulty and delivers the comfort. There is real value in Marcus Aurelius and Aristotle. But the practical value only comes through when you take the philosophy seriously on its own terms, when you let it actually challenge you, when you follow it to the uncomfortable conclusions, when you do not stop, when it stops being useful to your current preferences.
The third is philosophy as escape. The use of philosophical frameworks to avoid, rather than engage with, the difficulty of actual life. The person who retreats into abstract reasoning whenever emotional situations become threatening, what Jung would call intellectualization as a defense mechanism. The person who uses the language of philosophical uncertainty to avoid making commitments. The person who invokes the complexity of free will to avoid taking responsibility for their choices. Philosophy can be used as a tool for not thinking, and that is worth naming clearly.
And the fourth, the one I think is most insidious, is philosophy as performance. The social media version of the examined life, where the point is to demonstrate your sophistication and your access to difficult ideas rather than to actually grapple with them. The examined life is not a brand, it is a practice. And one of the most reliable signs that it has become a brand is that it has stopped being uncomfortable. I want to add a fifth, because I think it is one that philosophers themselves are most susceptible to. Philosophy as a substitute for action. The use of philosophical reflection, genuine, careful, serious reflection, as a way of perpetually deferring the choices and commitments that life actually requires. Hamlet is the literary version of this, a man of extraordinary intelligence and philosophical sensitivity who cannot act because every potential action is dissolved by the acid of his own analysis. The examined life is supposed to produce better action, not the paralysis of action. When the examination becomes its own end, when you are always preparing to live philosophically rather than living philosophically, the examination has gone wrong.
The existentialists were particularly alert to this failure. Sartre and de Beauvoir both insisted that authentic existence requires commitment, that the willingness to choose, to act, to take responsibility for the consequences is what distinguishes genuine philosophical living from the sophisticated avoidance of it. The person who has thought long and carefully about every dimension of a difficult choice and still cannot make it is not being more philosophical than the person who chooses. They are being less. Philosophy is supposed to clarify the stakes, sharpen the judgment, and then get out of the way. The choice is still yours to make. And making it, owning it, living with its consequences, being accountable for what it makes of you is the practice. So what is it then? If it is not a collection of positions, not a self-improvement hack, not an escape, not a performance, what does living philosophically actually look like from the inside?
I think the honest answer starts with a posture rather than a practice. A way of standing toward your own experience that is characterized by genuine curiosity, genuine willingness to be wrong, and genuine tolerance for the discomfort of not having things resolved. The Socratic tradition calls this aporia, the condition of being genuinely puzzled, genuinely uncertain, genuinely open to where the argument leads. And it is harder to sustain than it sounds, because the mind wants resolution. It wants a story that makes sense. It wants to be done.
There is a specific practice that several traditions converge on, which is the pause between stimulus and response. The Stoics called it the space in which choice lives. Anaphor's defense mechanisms are what happen when that pause is absent, when the mind responds automatically without your participation. Arendt's account of thoughtlessness is about the systematic elimination of that pause in institutional contexts. Marcus Aurelius's morning preparation was a way of building the pause in before the day began, before the situations arose that would make it hardest to maintain.
The pause is philosophical in the most basic sense. It is the moment in which you can ask, what is actually happening here? What am I actually responding to? Is my reaction tracking something real, or is it a defense mechanism, or a cognitive bias, or a projection of my own shadow onto someone else? You will not always have the right answer to those questions, but the habit of asking them, of introducing even a moment of genuine inquiry between the stimulus and the response, is what distinguishes the examined life from its alternative.
A second practice is what I would call honest inventory. Not the therapy version, not the excavation of childhood wounds, though that has its place, but the simpler, more regular practice of asking, where am I not being honest with myself right now? Where am I telling a story that is more comfortable than it is accurate? Where are my reasons actually rationalizations? Where did I decide first and construct the justification afterward? This is the territory Anna Freud and Jung and Kahneman were all mapping from different directions. The philosophical practice is the regular, deliberate return to those questions, not as an exercise in self-flagellation, but as a form of epistemic hygiene, keeping the lens clean.
A third practice is perspective extension, what Arendt called enlarged thinking, what the Stoics called the view from above, what philosophy of love calls finding a partner with compatible philosophical orientation, the practice of deliberately trying to see your situation from a standpoint that is not your own. Not to abandon your own perspective, that is not the goal, but to hold it alongside others, to test it, to see what it looks like from outside. This is both a moral practice and an epistemic one. Morally, it extends your circle of concern beyond your immediate interests. Epistemically, it makes your beliefs more robust by exposing them to perspectives that might challenge them.
And a fourth, which is perhaps the most Aristotelian, is what we might call deliberate engagement, the ongoing practice of bringing genuine attention and genuine care to the activities and relationships that constitute your life. Not just doing things, but asking what you are doing them for, what they are making of you, whether they are expressions of your actual values or performances of someone else's expectations. Aristotle's eudaimonia is not achieved through a single correct choice. It is built through the accumulated quality of attention you bring to how you spend your time, who you spend it with, and what you are becoming in the process.
Pierre Hadot, the French philosopher and historian of ancient philosophy, spent his career arguing that ancient philosophy was primarily a set of spiritual exercises, practices of attention, of self-transformation, of reorientation toward the world, rather than a set of doctrines. His book, Philosophy as a Way of Life, is one of the most useful things written about what it actually means to practice philosophy rather than study it. His argument is that the ancient schools, Stoics, Epicureans, Platonists, skeptics, were not primarily teaching theories. They were teaching ways of living. The doctrines were in service of the practices, not the other way around.
That inversion is important. In contemporary academic philosophy, the practices, if they exist at all, are in service of the theories. You engage with arguments about free will in order to arrive at a better theory of free will. In the ancient schools, you engaged with arguments about free will in order to transform your relationship to the things you cannot control, to actually practice the detachment that the Stoic theory recommended. The theory was a tool for changing how you live. And Hadot argues that much of what made ancient philosophy so productive and so durable was precisely this practical orientation, the insistence that philosophical work was not complete until it had changed something in the person doing it.
I want to be honest about the difficulty, because I think underplaying it is one of the ways the philosophical life gets distorted into something more marketable and less real.
The difficulty is not primarily intellectual. Most of the philosophical ideas we have covered in this show are not technically difficult to understand. The dichotomy of control is simple to state. The shadow is not a complicated concept. The difference between values and philosophy of life is clear enough once you have heard it. The difficulty is not comprehension. It is application. It is the gap between knowing the thing and actually doing it, between understanding that you are rationalizing and stopping the rationalization, between recognizing the defense mechanism and not deploying it, between seeing the cognitive bias and correcting for it.
The tradition is honest about this gap. Marcus Aurelius wrote the same reminders to himself for over 20 years. He was arguably the most powerful person alive, surrounded by Stoic philosophy from his youth, deeply committed to the practice, and he still found it necessary to remind himself every morning of things he had been trying to remember for decades. The gap between philosophical knowledge and philosophical living is not a problem that gets solved. It is a permanent feature of being human. The practice is the ongoing effort to close it slightly, imperfectly, every day.
There is also the difficulty of honesty. Real philosophical examination requires a kind of honesty about yourself that is genuinely uncomfortable. The shadow work Jung describes is not comfortable. The acknowledgement of cognitive bias is not comfortable. The recognition that your reasons are often rationalizations is not comfortable. De Beauvoir's insistence that the self is a project you are responsible for, that you cannot finally blame your circumstances or your history or your nature, is not comfortable. Philosophy at its most serious asks you to look at things you would rather not look at. And the mind, as we have spent 12 episodes documenting, is extraordinarily resourceful about not looking.
And there is the difficulty of sustained attention. The examined life is not something you do once in a moment of crisis or inspiration and then are done with. It is a continuous practice, which means it requires building it into the structure of your life in ways that do not depend on motivation or inspiration. The way Marcus built it into his mornings, the way the Stoics built it into both ends of the day, the philosophical life is a practice life. And like any practice, it requires a structure that supports it, even when, especially when you do not feel like practicing.
So why do it? If it is this hard, if it never produces certainty or completion, if the gap between knowing and doing never fully closes, what is the point?
I think the answer has several layers. The first is simply more accurate perception. The person who has developed some capacity for examining their own defense mechanisms, catching their cognitive biases, noticing their projections, that person is seeing more of what is actually happening. Not everything, not with perfect clarity, but more than they were before. And more accurate perception is the precondition for better choices, better relationships, less unnecessary suffering, both yours and others.
The second is what Arendt called the capacity for judgment, the ability to think from the standpoint of others, to assess particular situations rather than just applying rules, to resist the kind of thoughtlessness that makes participation in serious harm possible without recognizing it as harm. That capacity is developed through the practice of thinking through the habit of not simply accepting the first available interpretation, of asking what else might be true, of imagining how things look to people who are not you. It does not make you a moral saint, but it makes you less likely to be Eichmann.
And the third is something that is harder to articulate, but that I think most people who practice philosophy seriously would recognize. It is a quality of being more fully present to your own life, more genuinely there in the experiences you are having, the relationships you are in, the choices you are making. The unexamined life is not just epistemically inferior. It has a certain hollowness to it, the sense of moving through experience rather than inhabiting it, of being acted upon rather than acting. The examined life, at its best, is more fully lived. That is what Socrates meant. And it is, I think, worth the difficulty. Martha Nussbaum, in her book The Therapy of Desire, argues that the ancient philosophical schools understood their work as therapeutic in the most serious sense, not therapeutic in the modern clinical sense, but therapeutic in the sense of treating the fundamental disorders of human life. Fear, grief, desire that attaches to wrong objects, anger that distorts judgment, the inability to appreciate what you have. These are not just negative feelings to be managed. They are symptoms of a mind that has not yet found its proper orientation toward the world. And philosophy, in the ancient view, was the discipline by which that orientation could be developed, not quickly, not completely, but genuinely.
That framing resonates with me because it takes seriously both the difficulty of the project and the reality of the improvement. It does not promise transformation. It promises genuine, incremental, permanently incomplete progress toward a more accurate, more free, more fully inhabited relationship with your own life. That is the promise of the examined life as I understand it. It is not a small promise, and it does not require a philosophy degree or a reading list or even a podcast. It requires the willingness to keep asking the questions, even when, especially when, the answers are uncomfortable. I want to say something personal about what this show has been for me, because I think this kind of episode invites honesty, and I want to be honest.
Please.
Preparing these episodes, really working through the material, not just summarizing it, but trying to understand what each thinker was actually arguing and what it connects to, has changed how I think, not in a dramatic conversion experience way. In the incremental, almost invisible way that serious engagement with good ideas tends to work. I catch myself more often, I ask the pause question more often, I am more likely to notice when I am rationalizing, less likely to be completely confident that my first interpretation of a situation is the right one. That is not a philosophical achievement. It is just what happens when you spend time with the tradition seriously.
For me, the most lasting thing has been the grief episode, obviously for personal reasons, but also philosophically. The idea that grief is identity work, that it is the labor of renegotiating who you are around an absence that framework, has genuinely changed how I carry what I carry. It did not make the loss smaller, but it made it more intelligible. It gave me language for something that had been resisting language. And that is one of the things philosophy does at its best. It gives you language for what you were already experiencing, but could not yet clearly think.
Shawn said earlier that the examined life is more fully lived. I believe that. I also want to say that it is more fully felt, that the willingness to look clearly at your own experience, rather than managing it from a safe distance, means that both the joy and the difficulty land with more force. The examined life is not a more comfortable life. It is a more real one. And I think most people, at some level, want that more than they want comfort, even when comfort is easier.
The show is called Philosophy for Lunch because we wanted it to be accessible, something you could listen to on a lunch break, that treated philosophy as something for anyone who is curious, not just for people with advanced degrees. But the accessibility is a frame, not a reduction. The ideas are real, the questions are hard, and the invitation is genuine. To take these questions seriously, not as intellectual entertainments, but as tools for living more honestly, more deliberately, more fully. That is what philosophy is for. And it is what this show is trying to be about. The question this episode is asking, what does it mean to live philosophically, does not have a single answer. Different people will find different entry points, different practices, different thinkers who speak most directly to where they are. What matters is not which thinker or which tradition. What matters is whether the engagement is genuine, whether the ideas are doing something to you, whether they are changing what you notice and what you question and what you take seriously. That is the test. And it is when you apply to yourself, privately, in the quality of attention you bring to your own life. Nobody else can tell you whether you are passing it.
Next week, we are moving into the philosophy of language, what it means for words to mean anything at all, why Wittgenstein said that the limits of my language are the limits of my world, and what happens to philosophy when it takes seriously the idea that our most fundamental concepts might be more fragile than we assume. It is one of the stranger corners of philosophy and one of the most productive.
If this episode made you want to actually do something with philosophy rather than just think about it, that is exactly what it was designed to do. Share it with someone who is asking the same questions.
Sources and further reading are in the show notes.
We are Philosophy for Lunch, new episodes every Sunday.
Big ideas, human conversations.
See you next week.